Welcome to the Pain of Progress, Series 4, Civilizations. Tonight, I am honored to bring you part 1 of the history of the 13 dynasties that ruled China, from the ancient times to the 20th century. These dynasties brought a lot of innovations, technologies, and societal changes that are still felt in our modern world to this day. Our story begins with the Shah dynasty, which rose to power around 2070 BCE. Shah, which means glow of the sunrise, is believed to be the dawn of dynastic rule in ancient China. Prior to this, China was administered under the tribal system. The first ruler under this dynasty was Emperor Yao, who was considered a wise and great philosopher king. During his reign, he had a serious issue with the flooding of the Yellow River. This caused great disruption of agriculture and killed and displaced many of his people. He appointed the first person to try and fix the problem, a man named Gun. He tried for 9 years to fix the problem but could not. The next ruler, Yu Shun, was not happy with these failures. History is fuzzy as to what happened to Gun, but after he was gone, Emperor Shun asked his son Yu to continue working on the flooding. Yu realized that his father hadn't asked for the help he needed, as well as the fact that he had overestimated his abilities. Yu then enlisted the aid of the surrounding tribes to start digging canals to the sea to help alleviate the flooding. He worked on this project for 13 years, to great success. Emperor Shun rewarded Yu by giving him command of his armies, of which he had many victories, including driving away the San Miao tribe, who was hostile to the Shah. Yu was again rewarded by being made heir to the throne. Emperor Yu, also known as Yu the Great, was a great ruler who established a stable central government and organized the country into 9 provinces to make governing more manageable. Emperor Yu named his son Qi his successor, marking the beginning of dynastic rule in China. During the rule of the Shah dynasty, such inventions and innovations as the development of armor, rules of chivalry and battle came into being. The rule of Emperor Ji was the last under the Shah dynasty, as he was defeated by the next emperor, who created the Shang dynasty. Emperor Ji was a tyrannical ruler who had enacted very restrictive policies and very high taxes. King Tang was fed up with these policies and taxes. He eventually led a revolt and defeated Ji, sending him into exile, thus beginning the Shang dynasty. Tang reversed Ji's policies and taxes, forming a new government that worked for the people of his country. He and his successors kept a standing army of around 1,000 and lowered the number of conscripts and the requisite time to serve. Tang also instituted government-funded programs for the poor. The stability of the Shang dynasty created a thriving economy, freeing up labor to construct the Shang tombs, the Grand Canal, and many cities. The arts were just as important to the people of the Shang dynasty period as the military was. The craftsmen of the Shang dynasty worked in bronze and stone, especially jade. Bone, silks, and other high-quality materials were also used. Religious thought and rituals were on the rise as well. Ancestor worship was developed, as well as the link between the people, the king, and the gods. Taoism was also developed and refined during this period. They believed in an afterlife and that the king ruled by divine right. A solar calendar was also developed during the Shang dynasty. The traditional calendar was lunar, but the farmers needed to know better when to plant and harvest their crops. A man named Wan Yen measured time over a 1-year period with a sundial and a water clock. In the lunar clock, there were only 354 days a year. He proved that there were 365 days per year with his measurements. Wan Yen established the solstices and equinoxes and created the first perpetual calendar. Writing was also invented and developed during the Shang dynasty. By around 1250 BCE, an archaic form of Chinese script was in use. This helped in the areas of science and mathematics, as observations could be more accurately recorded and accounting principles could be developed. The I Ching, or the Book of Changes, was written around this time. Wu Ding was a great emperor under which very important advances in medicine, dentistry, and the fine arts were recorded. The dynasty declined until the last emperor Zhu. He neglected his duties and became an even worse tyrant than Emperor Ji from the Shah dynasty. He was eventually overthrown in 1046 BCE by King Wu, thus ending the Shang dynasty and beginning the Zhou dynasty. The Zhou dynasty was the longest lasting in China's history and was divided into two distinct periods. The first, the Western Zhou, covered 1046 BCE until 771 BCE. The second, the Eastern Zhou, continued on from 771 BCE until around 256 BCE. King Wu was the first king in the Western Zhou period, continuing the policies put forth during the Shang dynasty. As the kingdom expanded eastward, it became harder to maintain governmental control over the vast area. Family members and trusted generals established smaller states who would be loyal to the king. They instituted the policy of fengjian, which means establishment, as a feudal system and social hierarchy. Each separate state had its own legal system, tax code, currency, and militia. They paid taxes and homage to the king and sent along troops as needed. The early period of prosperity solidified the belief in the mandate of heaven concept to rule. This prosperity encouraged the well-field system, which divided lands between those designated for the nobility and the king, and lands that could be worked by and for the peasantry. This was one of the few times in China's history that the upper and lower classes worked together for the common good. Because of this time of prosperity and peace, literature was developed. Shi Jing, or the Book of Songs, was composed between the 11th and 7th centuries BCE, in which these poems would have been sung at court. They were thought to encourage virtuous behavior and compassion for all social classes. Many invasions and instability brings us to the Eastern Zhou period of the Zhou dynasty. Around 771 BCE, the Zhou clan moved the capital east to Luoyang during the spring and autumn period. Although the royal authority was weakened during this period, there were many contributions to literature, art, and philosophy. Sun Tzu wrote The Art of War during this time. The 100 schools of thought made contributions in philosophy that are still in use today. Confucius, Lao Tzu, who founded formal Taoism, and Han Feizi, who founded the school of legalism, all are significant contributors. At the end of the Zhou dynasty, the government was decentralized and many of the states had declared their independence, claiming that the Zhou kings had lost the mandate of heaven. Shang Yang, a Qin statesman, had advocated for war at all costs. In 221 BCE, Shi Huangdi of Qin took his advice, defeated all of the other states, and declared himself emperor. This marks the Qin dynasty as the first of imperial China. The early part of the Qin dynasty was spent unifying and consolidating power with a large military supported by a stable economy. There were ambitious projects taken on as well, such as building and connecting walls on the northern frontier and a new national road system. There are also Shi Huangdi's mausoleum that featured the life-size terracotta army. The Qin also standardized currency, weights, measures, and a uniform system of writing. Trade with the West was established around this time as well. This short-lived dynasty, however, was marked by intrigue and violence. Shi Huangdi and his need to control every aspect of his subjects' lives and fear of rebellion caused China to become a police state and turn the peasant class into little more than slaves. He also became obsessed with immortality and, as a consequence, died in 210 BCE after drinking an elixir of mercury. The last Qin ruler was assassinated after a rebellion in 206 BCE, ending the Qin dynasty. The lesson learned in the aftermath was that denying the past in attempts to create a present, which must finally be untenable because it has no foundation on which to stand. The Han dynasty restores the values of the Zhou dynasty, learning the lesson that one should not ignore history. The Han dynasty begins when Gao Zhu ascends to the throne in 202 BCE. This dynasty is divided into two distinct periods, the Western Han, also former Han, from 202 BCE to 9 CE, and the Eastern Han, also later Han, from 25 CE to 220 CE. During the Western Han, Emperor Wu opened up governmental positions to the lower classes and expanded the law code as to make everyone equal under the law. He also expanded trade with the West, further opening up the Silk Road. The break in between the Western Han period and the Eastern Han was filled by the very short-lived Qin dynasty. This period was soon considered a failure, as the regent decided that he could govern completely on his own without counsel. This new Qin dynasty came to an abrupt end with the Red Eyebrows Rebellion in 25 CE, and bringing Emperor Guangmu to power, continuing the Han dynasty, this time in the Eastern Han period. During the Han dynasty, music theory, the seismometer, and paper were all invented, with the water wheel being in use, producing power. The Silk Road not only opened up trade with the West, it also allowed religious, philosophical, and other cultural values to be passed between different civilizations. Unfortunately, the empire had grown too large for a centralized government, so it ended up falling in 220 CE. After the Han dynasty fell, it was a time of unrest. This was called the Six Dynasties period, which ran from 220 CE to 589 CE. Even though it was a chaotic time, it was an important era in the development of Chinese poetry. Buddhism began to flourish in both the north and the south of China, and is still a major religion to this day. China becomes unified once again in 589 under the rule of Emperor Wen Di. The dynasty only consisted of Emperor Wen Di and his son Emperor Yang Di, but they accomplished a lot in that short time frame. They consolidated control, improved and centralized the administration system, simplified the law code, and introduced land reforms. One of the great contributions to history is the construction of the Grand Canal, which connected the Yellow and the Yangtze rivers in a series of 3 canals. The road system was also improved, helping to further unify China. The Sui also extended and reinforced the Great Wall to help defend China's borders against the Eastern Turks. They also led a series of attacks on Korea and northern Manchuria between 598 to 614. All of these attacks ended in defeat with major losses of troops. Rebellion rose around 613 and lasted until 618, when Emperor Yang Di was assassinated. This led to the founding of the Tang dynasty. The Tang dynasty began with the reign of Gao Zhu in 618. He was a very effective monarch, instituting many reforms, including creating the Tang legal code in 624. One of the reforms he made was to prevent overtaxation of the peasant farmers. Wu Zetian was the first and only female emperor to rule over China from 683 to 704. She improved education, taxation, and agriculture. Emperor Xuanzong abolished the death penalty, improved security on the Silk Road, maritime trading, and financial reforms. An encyclopedia was also completed during his reign. Public libraries were built to house all of the books in print. Printed calendars were available for distribution. The first clock mechanism in the world was invented by Yi Xing in 725. The other inventions of the Tang dynasty were gunpowder, fireproofing, waterproofing, gas stoves, air conditioning, and automatons. During the Tang dynasty, tea became synonymous with sophistication in society. Lu Tong dedicated most of his poetry on his love for tea. The classic of tea was written by Lu Yu, who's known as the Sage of Tea. This was a treatise on the art of drinking tea. There are definitely 2 authors who must be added to any tea connoisseur's library. The Tang dynasty, however, would start a slow and steady decline once the An Lushan rebellion started in 755. He had seen the abuses of the family of the emperor's mistress and decided that the emperor was no longer fit to rule. The rebellion lasted till 763, when it was stopped by Emperor Daizong. Unfortunately, this weakened the Tang dynasty rulers, and the dynasty ended with the last of the emperors was killed in 907, thus beginning the 5 dynasties and 10 kingdoms period. The 5 dynasties and 10 kingdoms 72-year period was marked by division and political upheaval. This era, however, was the last prolonged period of multiple political divisions in China. In spite of the near-constant warfare, the economy and the culture grew. White ceramic pottery began to make an appearance, and landscape paintings were inspired by Taoism. Folk tales became popular, and new forms of fiction, such as tales of romance and adventure, came into vogue. Sadly, this period is viewed as a time of judicial abuse and excessive punishment. One of the 5 dynasties was most notorious for its use of severe torture. The security official for the capital was said to have executed prisoners without inquiry. Thankfully, this period would end with the founding of the Song dynasty in 960. Thank you so much for listening to the first part of the history of the 13 dynastic periods of China. Next week I will be covering the second part of the history of Imperial China and its effects on the modern day on the Pain of Progress Series 4, Civilizations.